Hey, this is Aaron Rabinowitz for CreativeCow.net. In my tutorial on scaling motion paths, I briefly mentioned roving keyframes, which I'd like to take a few moments to explain in depth. Most After Effects animators are fairly comfortable living in a world where position keyframes are locked to time, meaning that if you move a layer in the comp window and it creates a temporal keyframe in the timeline, that keyframe is set to occur at a particular point in time. So for example, this spatial keyframe here in the comp window has a corresponding temporal keyframe here in the timeline. You can see that because when I highlight a spatial keyframe in the comp window, its corresponding temporal keyframe is selected as well. And no matter how much I move this spatial keyframe around the comp window, the temporal keyframe's timing doesn't change. That doesn't mean I can't change the timing of a keyframe. Clearly I can just drag it in the timeline to wherever I want it to be. I'm just saying that moving a keyframe in the comp window doesn't change any timing of keyframes in the timeline. Now I know what you're thinking. That seems incredibly obvious, right? I mean, why would changing the position of a spatial keyframe affect the timing of its corresponding temporal keyframe here in the timeline? It shouldn't. Other than serving as a marking point in time for when a layer should appear at a particular place, a temporal keyframe has no real relation to its spatial counterpart, right? Well, not exactly. I'm not talking physics here, but with regard to After Effects, while it's true that in most cases time and space are mutually exclusive, there is a case where space affects time. Now I realize that this is starting to sound like a conversation you should be having with Stephen Hawking or Albert Einstein, but let me explain that in a way that doesn't make me sound so pretentious. Alright, if we do a RAM preview of the composition we've been looking at, we'll see that the red dot changes its speed a lot over the course of the animation. The motion isn't constant, shifting speeds over time. You can really see this if you zoom in and take a look at the dot's motion path. Dots closer together indicate slower motion, and dots further away indicate a faster motion. Now this is fine if your aim is to have your layer change speed over time, but if you're in a situation where you want a constant rate of speed but otherwise keeping the exact same motion, then you're in luck. After Effects gives us the tools to regulate the speed while preserving the motion path, and this tool is called Roving Keyframes. As I mentioned in my previous tutorial, roving keyframes are a type of keyframe used to keep a layer's speed smooth and constant with no variation. All we have to do is convert our normal temporal keyframes into roving keyframes, and the motion will be smoothed out, at least as far as speed is concerned. Let's take a look at how this works. Depending on which version of After Effects you're using, these steps for conversion will be a little bit different. In After Effects 6.5, here's how it works. In the timeline, I'm going to select my red dot layer and hit P to show the position keyframes. Next, I'll click on the position property twirl down, which reveals the position graph. You'll notice that there's a small box with an X through it under each temporal position keyframe except for the first and last ones. I'll explain why that is in a little bit, but for now what's important is that this box is the roving keyframe checkbox, which determines whether or not a keyframe is locked to time. I'll select all of my position keyframes by clicking on the word position, and then I'll click on any of the roving keyframe checkboxes, which as you can see unlocks everything but the first and last keyframe. The middle three keyframes immediately change from diamond-shaped keyframes and become small, round, roving keyframes, spacing themselves out differently in the timeline. And if you do a RAM preview, you'll see that our circular friend is now moving at a constant rate of speed, creating a much smoother flowing motion throughout the animation. Before we get into an explanation of what we've just done, let me show you how to do this in After Effects 7. In the timeline, I'm going to select my red dot layer and hit P to show the position keyframes. Next, I'll select all position keyframes except for my first and last ones, and then, with the keyframes selected, I'll right-click on any of those selected keyframes and from the pop-up menu, choose Rove Across Time. Alright, let me undo that so I can show you another way using the graph editor. To do that, I'll select the word position, and then I'll click on the graph editor button here to reveal the position properties graph. Next, I'll select everything but the first and last keyframe by drag-clicking across the graph editor like this. Make sure not to start your drag click on the actual curve, or it will just drag the curve, changing the keyframe's interpolation rather than selecting multiple keyframes, which is what we want to do here. With the keyframe selected, click on the Edit Selected Keyframes button here at the bottom and choose the same Rove Across Time option from the pop-up. It's hard to see the change here, but if you get out of the graph editor by clicking on the graph editor button, you'll see that again our keyframes have changed from diamond-shaped keyframes to circular-shaped roving keyframes, and of course they've spaced themselves out differently as they rove. Again, a quick RAM preview reveals a constant speed over the course of the animation. So how does all of this work? Well, basically in a nutshell, when you convert temporal keyframes into roving keyframes, they're no longer linked to a specific time. Their speed and timing are determined by adjacent keyframes. So based on the distance between spatial keyframes in the comp window, a roving keyframe will adjust itself in the timeline to evenly space out the timing of the animation, meaning it will make the speed of your layer's animation constant and smooth for that portion of your animation. What's important to be aware of is that based on the position of your spatial keyframes, your temporal keyframes will shift in time to keep the speed constant. So if I were to move this spatial keyframe further out, as you can see, the temporal keyframes move around in time to keep the speed going at a steady rate. As I mentioned earlier, the timing of roving keyframes are determined by adjacent keyframes. Consequently, the first and last keyframes can't be converted into roving keyframes. That's because the first and last keyframes determine the overall timing of the animation, and without that, roving keyframes couldn't do their job. The primary purpose of roving keyframes is to create a constant rate of motion within a given space of time. And so you need to have keyframes locked to time at each end to determine the length of time for the overall animation. By having two keyframes locked to time, what we're actually doing is telling After Effects at what point in time to start and end the animation for that layer. So in our example here, our animation takes place over 4 seconds, so we need a keyframe at the 0 mark and a keyframe at the 4-second mark to tell the roving keyframes that they can only rove within a given space of time, those 4 seconds. Otherwise, they just fly off the timeline, never to be heard from again, taking our animation along with it. The great thing about it is that we can actually expand or compress that time by just dragging the first or last keyframe, and the roving keyframes will adjust to keep the speed nice and smooth. The most important thing to understand is that it's the combination of both the position of our spatial keyframes in the comp window and the position of our first and last temporal keyframes in the timeline that will determine the speed of our animation. The spatial keyframes determine the distance that has to be traveled over the course of the animation, and the temporal keyframes determine how much time it has in which to do that traveling. So, if my animation is still taking place over 4 seconds, when I move the spatial keyframes apart like this, the red dot now has to travel faster to make up the longer distance in the same 4 seconds of time. On the other hand, if I kept the spatial keyframes the same, and spaced out the first and last temporal keyframes, then the red dot moves slower because it has more time to cover the same distance. Okay, some other important notes here. As I mentioned previously, roving keyframes only exist for properties that are related to spatial coordinates, so you can't use this for things like smoothing out a change of rotation or opacity. And again, even though roving keyframes are a type of position keyframe, they are temporal position keyframes, meaning available here in the timeline and not spatial keyframes which are found here in the comp window. Another thing I want to mention is that in both After Effects 6.5 and 7, another method of converting keyframes into roving keyframes can be done in the Keyframe Interpolation dialog, which can be accessed by selecting one or more keyframes and then choosing Animation, Keyframe Interpolation. At the bottom of the dialog is a pull-down called Roving, where you'll usually see the words Locked to Time. If you pull it down, you'll see the option for Rove Across Time. So if you've noticed this in the past and you wondered what it was for, well, now you know. I also want to mention that you don't need to convert every keyframe into a roving keyframe. If you want to smooth out a small portion of your animation, you can convert even one keyframe, or as many as you want. What will happen is that your roving keyframe will only rove between your outer two non-roving keyframes. Another important thing, yeah, that's right, we're not done just yet, is that if you decide you don't want your keyframes to rove anymore, you can turn them off the same way you turn them on. So for example, in After Effects 6.5, you would click on the Roving Keyframe checkbox, and in After Effects 7, you'd uncheck the Rove Across Time option in either the right-click pop-up menu or the graph editor's Edit Selected Keyframes button. Unfortunately, as you've probably noticed, despite converting back into regular keyframes, they stay put, and that means that all of your previous timing is lost. So if you want to get back to your original timing, don't convert your keyframes back into regular keyframes. Just hit undo until everything is back to where it should be. Anyway, I hope these tips keep you moving along nice and smooth. Once again, this is Aaron Rabinowitz for CreativeCow.net.